Hello, my magically inclined friends. It is I, MTG Mudsta, and today we're going to look at the Silverquill Statement EDH deck being released very soon. You can totally tell that this is legit because I'm wearing a not too small wizard hat on my head. But let's see what the deck contains. Interesting. Well, there's a lot of new cards and a lot of old cards, but I think it's more interesting to look at the new cards, and I'll let you decide on whether or not you want to keep the old cards in the deck for yourself. First up, we have the face card, Brina the Demagogue. For only 3 costs, she certainly has a lot of text on her, and really it just kind of boils down to if you have an opponent who attacks another opponent who has more life than an opponent, you get to put some +1/+1 counters onto stuff. On the whole, I'm not super sold on this card, but I do love the art, and I do love bird warlocks. Next up, we have Felisa, Fang of Silverquill. She's a vampire wizard, and costs a little bit more than our last commander, and she has Mentor, Flying, and an interesting ability. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, if it had a counter on it, mainly a +1/+1 counter possibly, you create X tapped 2/1 black Inkling tokens with Flying, where X is the number of counters that it had. This seems like a pretty fun way to make a bunch of tokens, since white does do a good job of putting +1/+1 counters onto other creatures. Next up is a Combat Calligrapher, who makes Inklings unable to attack you or planeswalkers you control. This is kinda cool because it's like a politics card, because it basically gives your opponents Inkling tokens that then can't be attacking you. Next up is Guardian Archon. For 6 mana we get a 5/5 flyer, that as it comes in, we get to choose an opponent in secret. When we decide to reveal that opponent, we and target permanent we control gains protection from chosen player until end of turn. We can only do this once, but that can be a pretty powerful effect to save us should we need. We have another legendary creature, although this one's a mono white one, and it's Nils, Discipline Enforcer. At the beginning of our end step, for each player, we get to put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature that player controls. He then has a second ability, which is significantly more interesting, and that reads, each creature with 1 or more counters on it can't attack you or planeswalkers you control, unless its controller pays X, where X is the number of counters on that creature. So on the one hand, we're helping to make our opponent's creatures bigger, but on the other hand, we're making it harder for them to attack us, meaning they have to go to our opponents. Interesting. We then have Promise of Loyalty, which is a 5-drop sorcery. Each player puts a vow counter on a creature they control, and then sacks the rest. It's kind of a sweet board wipe. Additionally, each of those creatures that got the vow counter can't attack us or planeswalkers we control, so even if they do leave their best creatures on the field, they can't come at us. Next up, for 4 mana, we get a Scholarship Sponsor. It has an ETB effect which allows us and opponents to go and find lands. This card can really help decks that have fallen behind, especially if you're playing against a green deck, by getting you basics, not to mention helping your opponents out at the same time. This can buy you some goodwill with them, and hopefully save you from being attacked for a turn or two. This next card was actually recently revealed on Twitter, and it's Secret Rendezvous. For 3 mana, you and target opponent get to draw 3 cards. This is a pretty sweet effect for white, and although you do have to give your opponents cards, you do have cards like Alms Collector in white that can help prevent how many they get. We have another large mana costing creature, this time with the Author of Shadows. It's a Shade Warlock that's a 3/3, and when it enters the battlefield, we exile all cards from all opponents' graveyards. Sweet! We get to choose one of the cards we exiled this way, and we can spend any color of mana to cast it as long as it's exiled. We have another fun black creature, this time with a Vampire Rogue in the form of Bold Plagiarist. It has Flash, which unfortunately makes me always think of Opposition Agent, but in this case the effect isn't as strong. Instead of denying your opponent's tutors, this creature just basically allows you to copy the amount of counters put onto an opponent's creature. We then have the Cunning Rhetoric, which is a 3-drop enchantment, and it reads, whenever an opponent attacks you or 1 or more planeswalkers I control, exile the top card of that player's library. You may play that card for as long as it remains exiled, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast it. I really like this card for 3 mana since it's kind of like a sweet rattlesnake card. They either have to commit to removing it, or they risk the chance of losing some of their great cards when they get exiled off the top of their deck when they attack you. Next up, we have a really sweet 3-drop, and probably my favorite legendary in this deck. It's Fane the Broker. Basically, if you like Trading Post, you're going to like this legendary. He has 4 relevant abilities, and oftentimes I find a card like this always has something to do. First up, you can sacrifice a creature to put 2 +1/+1 counters onto target creature. His next ability, which also might I add doesn't cost anything, is tapped, and you get to remove a counter from a creature you control to make a treasure token. His third ability reads, sacrifice an artifact, and we get to create a 2/1 white and black Inkling creature with Flying. Basically, each of these abilities feeds into the other one, and to put icing on the cake, It only costs 4 mana to untap him and do whatever you want again. This next card features one of the new mechanics from the set, and is Demonstrate. We get to mill 5 cards from our library, and then return a creature card from our graveyard to the battlefield. What Demonstrate allows us to do is copy that spell, but at the cost of giving our opponents a copy of it as well. So the way it works with Demonstrate is that if we copy the spell, basically both we and the opponent get a copy of it. The opponent's copy goes first, then we get our copy, and then we get the original. This means for potentially only 5 mana, at the cost of giving our opponent milling 5 and bringing back one of their creatures, we get to mill 10 and bring back 2 of ours. That seems like a pretty sweet trade-off. We then have a 2 mana, 2/2 human wizard called the Keen Duelist. At the beginning of our upkeep, we and target opponent each reveal the top card of our library. We then lose life equal to the mana value of the card revealed by the player, and we put it to our hand. If your deck wants to hurt you, like a Villas deck, this card is certainly for you. Next up is Stinging Study, an interesting way to draw cards for 5 mana. Essentially what it does is we draw X cards and lose X life, where X is the mana value of our commander, whether it's in the command zone or on the battlefield. I like the fact that this doesn't care where our commander is, since oftentimes people will use removal spells on your commander when casting this. We have another rare, and this time it's Ink Shield for 5 mana. We prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to us this turn, and for each 1 damage prevented, we get to create a 2/1 white and black Inkling token with flying. There are definitely cheaper ways to save yourself, but this could be a great way to generate a bunch of tokens. Next up, if you enjoyed the Tempt with X type of cards, this is a card for you. For 4 mana, we get a Tempting Contract. At the beginning of our upkeep, each opponent is allowed to create a treasure token for themselves. If they do, we get a treasure token for each of the opponents who does. That means, potentially, they each could ramp by 1, while we ramp by 3. A new land is being introduced into EDH, and that's Study Hall. It taps for 1 colorless, and you can also pay 1 and tap it, and add 1 mana of any color. When we spend this mana to cast our commander, we scry X, where X is the number of times our commander has been cast from the command zone. This effect can add up very quickly, especially if you have a commander or a card like Food Chain, which often has you putting your commander back to the command zone. There's also this new 2 mana instant Fracture, which I think is going to be a new EDH staple. For a white and a black, you get to destroy an artifact, an enchantment, or a planeswalker at instant speed. This seems incredibly powerful, and something I'm probably going to put into my Tymna and Vile Smasher deck. We also have one of the new common lands from Strixhaven, a Silverquill Campus. These come into play tapped, and can be tapped for either white or black, but have the added benefit of being able to pay for 4, and you tap it and scry 1. I wouldn't say this is as good as Temple of Silence, but if you have a lot of mana and often find yourself drawing into dead cards, having this land on the battlefield might help you find and dig into something better. So now we're going to look at the rest of the deck, which is just reprints. Creature-wise, we have 18 of them, with good cards like Angel of Serenity, Deathbringer Liege, Elite Scaleguard, Knight of the White Orchid, things you typically want to see in a black and white deck. There are a few good cards that work with the +1/+1 counter strategy, like the Selfless Squire and the Sunscorched Regent. As for sorceries, we have a decent board wipe with Tragic Arrogance, as well as Ambition's Cost to help give us more of a draw package, and Infernal Offering to do fun things. For instance, we already saw Fracture, which is a fantastic new card to the deck, but we also have Oblation and Utter End, which will help us deal with other, non-specific permanents. Artifact-wise, we have our typical ramp package, including Soul Ring and Arcane Signet, as well as some fun additions like a Bloodthirsty Blade. This works particularly well with Brina the Demagogue, since Goad forces your opponents to attack another opponent, so ideally they do it in a way that basically triggers her ability. We also have Pendant of Prosperity, which is an interesting card because I've never actually been able to play it or see it played. For me anyway, it resonates more with a Zedruu kind of deck, but I can see it working well with Orzhov since the politics tend to play very heavily into this deck, and you want to please some opponents and allow them to attack other opponents. We also have one Planeswalker with Gideon, Champion of Justice. I think his +1 ability works really well with a token-based deck, and a lot of the commanders in this deck do have a token strategy. This way he can either be an attacker, or you can use his +1 and hopefully have him survive until your next turn, use his ultimate to exile all of their permanents. Enchantment-wise, we have more cards that feed into the idea of making your opponents want to attack stuff, with things like Duelist Heritage, where we're able to give our opponents attacking creatures double strike. There's also Curse of Disturbance, which is a great way to incentivize people to go at other opponents, since it gives them tokens at the same time as benefiting you. There's also Vow of Duty and Martial Impetus, which basically forces our opponents to attack other creatures once more, feeding into that Brina the Demagogue type ability. As for lands, there's 39 of them, and it's pretty typical of what you find in a precon. It's got Command Tower, Myriad Landscape, A couple come into play tapped dual lands, but there's a nice addition of Mokokoro, as well as Temple of Silence to help round it out and give us a bit of draw and scry. And that's pretty much everything. As you see, the deck works pretty well out of the box. I think there's a lot of cards that tie together well with Brina, maybe less so with the other commanders, but I think it's mainly meant to focus on this one. I think these decks are shaping up to be just as good as the Zendikar Rising ones, with them being very playable right out of the box. I'm hoping in the future to be able to find some time to play some of these precons together and see which one does the best. As always, thanks to Wizards of the Coast for sending me this free preview, and I hope you guys enjoyed it.